In the middle of a cold desert night, where the stars spilled like silver dust across the endless black sky, a young woman stumbled toward the faint glow of a campfire. Her steps were heavy, her clothes torn, and her face pale with exhaustion. She carried nothing but a small bundle tied with a piece of rope, and the weariness in her eyes spoke of many days spent wandering without shelter. She stopped at the edge of the light, shivering, staring at the figure seated by the fire. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and eyes that flickered like the flames themselves. He was Apache. His people whispered his name with both respect and fear, for he was known as the man who never welcomed strangers. His camp was sacred to him, his solitude unbroken, and those who dared to come near were usually turned away with nothing but cold silence. But tonight, the young woman did not turn back. She stood with trembling hands and whispered in a voice that cracked with desperation, "Solo necesito un lugar para dormir." Just a place to rest, just for one night. Her words hung in the air like a fragile plea, almost swallowed by the hiss of the fire. The Apache's hand paused over the wood he was about to place in the flames. His dark eyes rose slowly to meet hers, and for a long moment there was no sound, no movement, only the weight of her request pressing against the silence. He had lived many years without trusting anyone beyond his tribe. Strangers meant danger. Strangers meant betrayal. And yet, there was something in the young woman's gaze, a raw honesty, a quiet dignity even in her desperation, that stirred something inside him he had not felt for years. Still, his voice came low and stern. "This fire is not for strangers. My camp is not open ground." Her lips quivered, but she did not beg further. Instead, she lowered her eyes, wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and turned slightly as if preparing to face the cold night alone. Something inside him tightened. He had seen strong men bow under the desert's merciless night wind. He had buried friends whose bodies grew stiff beneath the frost. And here was this fragile figure, refusing to plead further, ready to accept death with quiet resolve rather than trouble him with more words. Against his own nature, against the habits of a lifetime, he spoke again. "Stay," he said, his voice clipped. "But only until sunrise." The young woman's breath caught, her shoulders trembling with relief. She stepped closer, the firelight revealing her face, soft features marred by dust, but her eyes carried a resilience that surprised him. She sat near the flames, careful not to come too close, and for a while neither of them spoke. The night stretched long, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken thoughts, with questions neither dared to ask. By dawn, he expected her to leave without a word, like the countless others he had refused in the past. But when the first rays of sunlight painted the desert gold, she did not rise. Instead, she remained sitting quietly, her hands wrapped around her knees, as though gathering the courage to move on. The Apache frowned. "The night is over. You asked for rest. Now you must go." She nodded slowly, but her voice trembled when she answered. "I will go. But before I leave, I want to thank you. You don't know what it means to have a safe place even for one night. I have walked through villages where doors shut in my face, through towns where people turned away as though I were invisible. I have learned to expect nothing. But last night, for the first time in weeks, I felt human again." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had lived his life guarding his camp, shutting the world out, believing that kindness only invited pain. But her gratitude was not heavy with expectation. It was light, sincere, like water poured onto parched earth. He studied her quietly. "Where are you going?" he asked. She lifted her gaze to the horizon, her eyes distant. "Anywhere that will let me begin again. My family is gone. My village burned. I have no place to return to. Every step I take is a search for somewhere I belong." The Apache said nothing, but her words stayed with him long after she left his camp that morning. He thought he would never see her again. Yet, 2 nights later, as the desert winds howled crueler than before, she returned. She did not come closer, only stood at the edge of his firelight, as if unsure whether she had the right. Something within him shifted, and without being asked, he gestured toward the flames. "Sit," he said simply. That night passed like the first, but this time, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, it was the silence of two souls carrying invisible burdens. On the third night, when she appeared again, he did not wait for her plea. He only nodded toward the fire, and she smiled faintly, the first smile he had seen from her. As days turned into weeks, she began to help in small ways. Without asking, she gathered dry wood for the fire, fetched water from the stream, mended worn leather straps. She never demanded anything in return, never overstayed her welcome, yet slowly her presence began to soften the harsh lines of the Apache's solitary life. He had spent years believing kindness was weakness, but through her quiet strength he began to see it as something else, something powerful enough to heal. One evening, as the sky bled crimson and the fire crackled between them, he finally asked, "Why do you trust me? You know nothing of me." She looked into the flames, her voice soft but steady. "Because you listened when no one else did. You gave me a place when the world closed its doors. That is enough." Her answer lingered in his chest like a forgotten song. He realized then that compassion was not a chain that bound, it was a bridge that connected. The turning point came one bitterly cold night, when a storm swept across the desert. The wind tore through the camp, rattling the wooden stakes and scattering the fire's embers. The young woman shivered uncontrollably, her thin shawl no match for the freezing gusts. Without a word, the Apache took his own heavy blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. For the first time, their eyes met not as host and stranger, but as two people who understood the weight of loneliness and the miracle of shared warmth. From that night forward, something unspoken grew between them. Trust, fragile yet steady, wove its way into their silence. He began to tell her stories. Tales of his people, of battles fought, of lessons learned from the earth and sky. She listened with eyes wide, not as an outsider, but as someone who cherished every word. In return, she shared pieces of her past, memories of her mother's lullabies, her father's laughter, the smell of bread baking in the mornings of her lost village. Each story was like a stone laid upon another, building a foundation of connection where once there had only been walls. Months passed, and the man once feared for his solitude was no longer alone. The villagers who had once whispered about the Apache began to notice the change. They saw the stranger by his side, the softness in his once guarded eyes, and they too began to believe that even the coldest hearts could be warmed. One day, as the sun rose over the desert, the young woman looked at him and said, "I came here asking only for a place to sleep. But what I found was a place to belong." His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears. He realized that her arrival had not been a burden, but a blessing. She had given him something far greater than companionship. She had reminded him that humanity's greatest strength was not in walls or weapons, but in the courage to open one's heart. And so, the Apache who never welcomed strangers, became the man who learned to share his fire. His camp was no longer a place of solitude, but a home where two souls, once lost, now found, discovered that kindness could transform not only a night, but a lifetime. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single act of compassion, and the courage to say yes when the world has always said no.